Warning. The following episode is far too long for a new channel to reasonably expect anyone to sit through. You can navigate the links in the description below to skip to what interests you in particular. Thank you. Welcome to my channel, Alt Control Gaming. Oh, I can see the name is a bit pants, isn't it? Hopefully, at the very least, it will convey effectively what this channel is about, which is coming up with alternative controls for your gaming. Yeah, it doesn't really work, does it? Apologies also, this is the best I got, I'm afraid, just some crappy little mic I bought for 5 years ago. God knows why, never really used it for anything. And I will be looking to up the production values as you know, the channel, you know, as time goes on. But for now, I'm afraid this is the best I've got. That's not really viable for me to improve on that at this moment in time. But yeah, these intros, as you could probably tell, are going to be unscripted. It just kind of seems a bit more, you know, personable, a bit more informal. Don't worry though, for the actual content of the videos, you know, I have scripted it, mostly because I don't really fancy fucking up. But yeah, and you know, particularly on today's episode, the controller profile is a fairly complicated one. You know, there's yeah, it's doing some different things, and it can be quite easy to sort of forget as you're going through it. Believe me, I tried like rehearsing it so I could just do it live, and there was still one or two things that I forgot. So I have scripted it out. So yeah, you might notice a sudden shift in my cadence. That's because I'm really not used to reading from scripts. Yeah, I've written scripts. You know, I did film studies at university and did nothing with it since.
I guess we all have one thing we regret giving up. One thing we really miss. That we gave up because we were too lazy. Or we couldn't stick it out. Or because we were afraid.
And but yeah, so don't worry, it's not all going to be rambling like this. So yeah, we're going to be using the Steam Controller Configurator to come up with custom controls for your PC games. Before we get into it, as this is the first video, I'll give a brief introduction to the channel at large, a little bit about myself.
They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you.
What motivated me to make these videos in the first place. And more importantly, why you should stick around for future videos. Now, we got straight into my face for this video. I do have an intro prepared. So it will serve as a nice little sneak peek for what you can expect. So yeah, roll intro. The guns are the shootiest, the kicks are the bootiest, the shrines are the fruitiest, the sims are the snootiest. The bards are lootiest, the horns are dutiest at Alt Control. The wars are the bloodiest, the beasts are the cuddliest, the cities are the floodiest, and Henry is the muddiest, the fish the ruddiest, the boss is the cruddiest at Alt Control. Gaming. So, yeah, who's this fluffy-haired twit getting up in my gaff on my screen? My name's Tom. Hi. And, yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about me, really. I'm Tom. Well, no, I'm just a dude who just really likes video games, and yeah, I mean storytelling in general. You know, I love films, I love books, and you know, but there's something about video games for me that, you know, it just weaves, you know, the unique ability to weave these compelling narratives with, you know, complex mechanics that act as like tests of skill, patience, situational awareness, lateral thinking, and all good stuff like that. And even if you don't really care about narratives and things like that, you know, there are a plethora of reasons why games are just such a compelling medium. And if you're watching this video, I'm sure I don't need to tell you why you enjoy the games that you play. And but as there are a plethora of games out there, so many games out there. In fact, I don't think I'm gonna get through a 10th of my Steam library. Thanks, Humble Bundle. But yeah, you know, there's just so much to choose from. You know, they've all got like, you know, such a rich diversity of like mechanics and, you know, tests of all those skills that I mentioned. And yeah, and with that, lots of different ways for the player to interact with those games. You know, lots of different controller layouts and things like that. Now you do, of course, have like a standard for certain genres. You know, you're not getting that much deviation in, you know, in terms of like first-person shooters, for example. You know, left stick is move forward, right stick is look, and shoot is trigger, and stuff. You know, that it. Obviously, there are subtle differences, but like generally, there is like a comfortable sort of standard, you know, that a lot of different genres adhere to. But that doesn't need to limit you in any way. Because, you know, as you're going to see, what we're going to be doing in this channel is seeing what kind of, you know, taking existing games and seeing how we can sort of tweak the controls just to either improve them, you know, if the controls are broken in some way, and, you know, there are certain aspects that kind of annoy you, or maybe even just want to like adjust the controls so they are a bit more familiar. And you know, or it might just be seeing what else you can come up with, you know, seeing if they're, you know, now I'm a sucker for immersion. Like I love to feel lost in a game's world, so like, you know, there are changes that you might want to make that kind of just put you in the shoes of your character, just to, you know, just have that sense solidified a little bit more. And yeah, and like, you know, I do sort, yeah, I've ever since I was a child, I've wanted to make video games, really. And I've got, you know, my head is just full of ideas, and I've got like scraps of paper, like just chock-a-block full of, you know, ideas for mechanics and storylines and things like that. And but to this day, I've not ever made a game. I've not made a game yet. Now, I am getting that ball rolling. Still in pre-production at this point. I say pre-production like it's a professional. It's just me making the game. But you know, I'm very excited about it. I'm not going to go too much into it now, but the reason why I bring it up is because it has sort of got me to focus a bit more on the way I'm interacting with the games that I'm enjoying right now, and also sort of going back to some older games and just sort of seeing how, you know, even if they didn't have controller support to begin with, you know, putting controller support in and just making it work in such a way that it feels natural and intuitive and more importantly just fun to control. And so yeah, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that, and you know, and so I've been using the Steam Controller Configurator to come up with my own custom controller profiles, and yeah, just sort of seeing like how I can drastically change things, or just, as I said before, just kind of, you know, make little subtle improvements here and there. And yeah, it's been a surprisingly it's been enlightening and surprisingly fun as well. Like, I've, much like how I mod like Bethesda games, you know, I would spend like hours and hours, you know, just trying out different mods and things like that, and then probably only playing it for like half an hour. You know, probably because I've got my load order booked and everything just crashes. But yeah, similarly, I've just really enjoyed just creating a profile for a game, testing it out a bit, and then moving on to the next thing. But yeah, I thought, you know what, like I'm quite confident that I've come up with some cool ideas, and I think would be interesting to share with you, and hopefully you feel the same way. You might sort of learn something and decide to try and kind of implement similar sort of changes for your own games, perhaps. But yeah, that is really what the focus of these videos are going to be about. Just seeing how we can either add controller functionality to games that don't natively support it, improve controls for games where they need improvement, or just seeing what fun you can have just drastically changing the way you interact with some of your favourite games. So you've chosen what you want to play for whatever reason you want to play it, but now there is how you play. As well as keyboard and mouse, most PC games released today natively support controllers, certainly those on the X input standard, although support for D input is also gradually becoming the norm, if we're not there already. You will of course get games where a controller doesn't seem to make sense, or traditionally there hadn't been much demand for it. Real-time or 4X strategy games, isometric CRPGs, simulations with mechanics for the most granular of details. These usually demand a pretty busy mouse-driven user interface and or a plethora of keybinds, more than a controller can support, or so it would seem at first glance. In recent years, a couple of outliers stretching back even further, we have seen games like Halo Wars, Civilization 6, Divinity Original Sin, and 2 Point Hospital, to name a few. To varying degrees of success, these games have brought those genres to consoles with controller support. Divinity has certainly been a trendsetter in that regard. It was such a confident first try, and I think they absolutely nailed it. I'm pretty sure at least that it was the first isometric CRPG to attempt controller support, but in any case, Pillars of Eternity came out just shy of a year later, and that had no native controller support. But Pillars 2 and also Pathfinder Keymaker have console versions with controller support. I've not tried either of those games yet, so I can't comment on how well they pull it off, but I do recall the original Divinity being a huge success, and the sequel has gone on to do better still. So, isometric CRPGs from the comfort of your couch, that seems to be here to stay. Hopefully anyway. And to me that is a good thing, an excellent thing. As I stumble deeper and deeper into my 30s, all those years of working desk jobs and not going to the gym are starting to take their toll. When I have free time to play games, I really just want to kick back and slouch so hard that my couch is practically devouring me, and yeah, you don't really have to sit at a desk to operate your keyboard and mouse. Take my couch for instance, while it perhaps clashes with the rest of the room somewhat, it does have nice flat arms that, well, need I explain? Flat surface, plus mousepad, and you have a workable substitute for a desk. And then you just simply pop your keyboard on your lap. But even if you do have a poorly colour coordinated flat arm sofa serving as a workable substitute for a desk, you probably have to do what I do, which is bunch up so you can rest your elbow on the arm as well. And that is no way to slouch. There are ways and means around that, of course. You could spend money on all sorts of peripherals, specifically designed for couch, keyboard and mousing, or you could just have a look around your house for something suitable to rest on, like a tray, a chopping board, a spare side panel, that corpse you found in the garden. It's not that hard to find a comfy enough couch setup with keyboard and mouse. If you don't have a good controller, say an Xbox 360 or Xbox One pad, DualShock 4, and you're thinking of spending money on peripherals to accommodate keyboard and mouse from your couch, perhaps spend that money on a controller instead. It'll almost certainly be cheaper as well, and regardless of whether you're buying something or using what you already have, but you're still resistant to using a controller, keep an open mind as you watch these videos, as I may persuade you into at least considering switching to a pad. even just to treat yourself to a good old slouch now and then. Before I do, I will just give a quick mention to something that you can try if you don't want to lose your mouse. I had this PlayStation 3 navigation controller sitting around for years. I think I bought it and moved controller secondhand, but never actually used it. This navigation controller specifically was an optional peripheral for the PlayStation Move, which I assume you could get bundled together with a game or two, Unfinished Swan or something. I can't actually remember what Move games there were. I didn't own a Move at the time, although, yeah, it was I was somewhat intrigued. by it. In my opinion, most games, even first-person shooters, handle fine with a controller, but you will come across games that have native controller support that maybe feel a bit off because of how it handles look acceleration and deceleration or something like that. Metro 2033 Redux was such a game for me. It was certainly playable, but it just didn't feel right. So I started mapping everything to the left side of the controller and holding it in one hand and using the mouse with the other. And it's a bit cumbersome for someone like me with little donnies, but you can rest the controller on your lap and it's actually not a bad solution at all. Anyway, at this point I remembered my PS3 nav controller and a little light bulb started into life above me head. I must admit, there was maybe a fraction of a second where I had this burst of adrenaline as though I'd stumbled onto this revelatory new idea that would change the landscape of gaming forever. But as fractions of a second tend to do, it quickly passed and I realised, you know what, smart people, not idiots like me who think they're smart, actually smart people, most likely had drivers written for this thing the day it was released. Which was,
It's fucking nearly 10 years ago, mate. Warning team, temporal disruption complete. Time is now the enemy.
Yeah, someone's had this idea by now. And sure enough, I looked online and there seems to be a few ways to go about getting the nav controller to work with Windows. Couldn't tell you about other platforms, I'm afraid. Once I'm done with this preamble, we'll be focusing almost exclusively on Steam. There are plenty of tutorials out there for Windows though. I'll just link to this gentleman. This was the first video I came across, and the actual setup is within the first 3 minutes of the video, so just follow along to that. It's dead simple and it's the one that I used. The video does miss a step in the installation process. Before you get to the part where you select the drivers you want, there will be install options. Just leave them all as default unless you know what you're doing. Link for that video can be found below in the description. But yeah, with a tray on your lap you can enjoy a rather comfortable couch experience without losing mouse precision. This is actually my preferred way to play most first-person shooters now. That said, it can be quite a head-scratcher trying to cram everything onto its 9 buttons, or 10 if you include the home button. Ideally, you'll have at least a couple of extra buttons on your mouse. For example, games with crouch, sprint and jump actions. I recommend having crouch on one of those extra buttons. If you fancy having a play about with it, I'm sure you'll quickly see why. I'm not going to go any deeper into it now, but I may consider doing a video about the nav controller in the future. But something to bear in mind all the same. Okay, so my argument is that for a 30-something like me, lazing on the couch with a controller is more comfortable. So what? Is that all I'm bringing to the table? So, the big drawback for me with controllers was the relative lack of buttons compared to a keyboard. In the majority of games this is fine. For better or for worse, most AAA games at least are designed with controllers in mind. Problem is, I feel there's also a lack of courage. I think developers get worried about control setups that are too busy. And for the most part, combination of button presses are avoided. Take Doom 2016, just pretend it's Doom Eternal. I don't have it yet, I'm sorry. Or The Witcher 3. I will be covering both of these games extensively in later videos, but for now, Here is some footage that will be familiar to keyboard and mouse users. Just switching weapons or casting different signs on the fly. No interruptions, nothing taking you out of the action. Now here is how this looks playing these games with a controller using the native configuration. Now I know people are fine with this, it's not really a bad solution to be fair, but both these games and many others that use these weapon wheels have exciting combat, well, once you install the Enhanced Edition mod for The Witcher 3 that is. And while it can give the player a breather, having the game slow down, giving you time to select your next tool of death, I would prefer it to be optional. The button you press to activate that wheel, what if instead I hold it down and press another button to instantly switch to that weapon? There's really no need to withhold that hotkey style weapon select from controller users. With a smart layout and the right HUD communication, it would be pretty seamless getting the player on board. So, we're getting on in life, we just want to game from our couch, but default controller setups are a little too neutered or completely non-existent, particularly if you're playing older games. Really, that summarises the aims of this channel quite nicely. We'll be using the Steam Controller Configurator to improve games that natively support controllers where they need improvements, adding controller functionality to games that don't natively support it without dumbing things down. And also, something I hadn't mentioned yet is employing a little lateral thinking. You can really get creative and dramatically change the way you interact with these games. I want the controls to feel as natural as possible, so we'll explore how we choose when to adopt or ditch familiar conventions. As I've mentioned, I am a sucker for immersion in games, so I really try to make decisions that will enhance the sensation of being in the game's world, so long as it doesn't sacrifice playability, of course. You'll see a good example of that in today's episode, where I strongly believe it not only enhances immersion, but also gives you a bit of an edge as well. So for each video going forward, there'll be an overview of the controls I've come up with, what the benefits are, what it perhaps does differently, and then walk through the process of setting up those bindings. Whenever I release a video, I'll also be publishing the game's profile on Steam, so if you'd rather just download it, have a look out for Alt Control Gaming in the community profiles. Commanding your units.
Is that radical?
Right, so first things first, I'm going to show you how to get Steam set up so you can start using custom profiles in your games. Something that you may just want to check out first is located in the desktop settings. Make sure you have interface selected on the left so that on the right you see these checkboxes. Run Steam when computer starts should be on by default. Start Steam in big picture mode won't be. It's quite self-explanatory. I have it selected, but you don't have to. Big picture mode isn't actually required at all. I prefer to use it because it makes everything big. And if you're not overcompensating like I am and you're content with the desktop interface, here very quickly is where you access what we are about to cover. And also, if we reverse time for just a moment, we can see here is where you would configure the profile of a specific game. So once you've clicked on the game in the library, you just want to click this little guy right here. Back to the present. So from here, top right of the screen, you have big picture mode. Click this button and so click on the cog icon, and here you see the same options as before, just worded and arranged slightly differently. General controller settings is just controller settings. Big picture, desktop, guide button, chord configurations are located in the base configurations option. Head into controller settings and ensure the controller that you will be using is ticked. I already have mine ticked. I use a DualShock 4 and an Xbox One pad, and the nav controller I mentioned earlier actually comes down under Xbox One, as that is what the drivers trick Windows into thinking it is. But if your controller isn't any of those named here, then chances are it'll come under the generic gamepad option. Just be aware though, the DualShock 4 is a device that uses the D input standard, and when you enable this, Steam will read the inputs from the DS4 and essentially translate it into the X input standard. I'm not going to set up anything specific here for desktop use or doing anything with the guide button. I'll let you decide what is the best fit for your general PC use. You may get some ideas from some of the tweaks we'll be implementing into the game profiles, and I certainly do recommend you consider making your own profiles for these if you intend to use your controller for more than just games. I do actually have desktop profiles to work with the Unreal Editor and Blender. They are both works in progress, but I'll likely share them when they are a bit more fully featured. For now though, I'm just going to show you how to create a template that you can use for any game. I create this template using the desktop configurator. You don't have to, but I just find it easier to find knowing it is associated with the desktop. So to start with, I'm just going to use a keyboard and mouse template. If you wanted to, you could also create a template with controller buttons as the base for games that do have native support. I won't be doing it here, but you can see what to select if you want to do it. From here, I am just going to create some action layers for each input. But what are action layers? Good question. Thanks, me. Well, as you can see from this template, you have mouse and keyboard functions bound to controller inputs. So if you're in a game with this profile, right trigger will always be left mouse and left trigger will always be right mouse, for example. With action layers, you can change these functions when a criteria of your choosing is met. So for example, I am going to create an action layer and name it Y. Now this on its own does absolutely nothing, but if we have it selected, you will see that all the bindings now show a bit darker, like they're greyed out or something. Now let's say that when I am holding the Y button, I want the left trigger to bring up the escape menu. I'd never create such a binding, but just as an example. So with this action layer selected, if I go to the left trigger and change soft pull from right mouse to escape, you can now see that this input is showing brighter than the others. What this tells us is that when the action layer is active, the function of soft pull left trigger will change, but all the other bindings will remain the same. This is actually part of the reason why I create action layers for everything, because it is easier for the player who is browsing your controller profile to see what changes what. And unless you actually mod the game itself, you're not going to have the benefit of a HUD communicating your bindings during gameplay, so having a nice, clear and easy to read profile is essential. That, and it just seems to be more reliable than doing mode shifts or chords for everything, which I'll quickly show you now. So without an action layer selected, although you can do this in action layers as well, if we go to the left trigger, we can see on the right there is a mode shift option. Select this, and as you can see, the bindings have seemingly disappeared. Relax so, they haven't. The same function will still play out if you are just pulling the left trigger. What you want to do from here is select the mode shift button option. You'll now choose from a list of buttons that, when held, will change what left trigger does. So if we select Y, and then specify soft pull as escape, and voila! Same effect has been achieved more or less. But you may have noticed on this list that not all buttons are there. The D-pad is entirely absent, so that is a limitation to be aware of. Also, not every button that you wish to be modified has the option to be mode shifted. The ones that can are your triggers, analog sticks, D-pad and face buttons. As for chorded presses, they don't have those particular restrictions. If we select the soft pull binding and then at the bottom of the screen select show activators, this will allow you to add functionality to the left trigger. So as you can see, a regular press will fire off the right mouse button. This can vary from game to game with how they read inputs, but generally a regular press means the button has been selected and deselected in one push and lift of the finger or thumb. You can change this here, so instead you'd have to hold the button down for a determined length of time. Can have it so it only fires off if you double tap. There's options for the moment you start pressing a button or the moment you release the button, and then there are also chorded presses. So if we now click Add Activator, this will give us an additional function which we can choose as a chorded press. So if we select the binding as escape and specify the chorded button as Y, then Bob's your uncle, same effect achieved yet again. Like mode shifting though, you cannot select individual D-pad buttons to be chorded with. Another reason why I just prefer to use action layers. Now you may run into circumstances where a chorded press or mode shift may actually work better than an action layer. There will be a couple of examples in today's featured game actually. You may even find circumstances where an action layer on paper makes more sense, but for whatever reason just doesn't work properly. I personally haven't encountered such an instance, but it is possible, whether it be down to how the game handles certain inputs or maybe even a bug in Steam. And if you find yourself in a situation like this, try a mode shift or a chorded press. If that still doesn't solve the issue, then you'll just have to come up with a different solution, I'm afraid. There will be some degree of troubleshooting when building your controller profile, so expect the unexpected. Also, just a quick note about regular press and long press. If, say, you had the back button bound to tab, and in the game you needed to hold the tab key, as is the case in Bannerlord for exiting an area, you can still hold a button that is designated as a regular press, and it will still hold. You would only need a long press if, for example, you wanted a single press to be tab, but a long press to be something else entirely. You've most likely noticed that as well as action layers, there are also action sets. Key difference between the two is that action layers layer on top of your bindings. Hello! Whereas an action set will completely swap out one set of bindings for another. Very good! They certainly have their place. I sometimes use them to switch between desktop applications, for example, but for games, generally I avoid using them. One reason, and this can happen with chorded presses and mode shifts as well, is that an input may not deactivate properly if you switch action set while actively pressing a button or moving a thumbstick, and you can get into a situation where the player feels like they've lost control. Big no-no. Also though, I want any swapping of functions on the fly to be as seamless as possible. It may just be a me thing, but if, for example, every time I opened a map screen but something didn't work as expected because I have to use another input to switch the control layout, it gets very repetitive and feels like a bit of a chore. So for controller profiles that I design, I always avoid requiring the player to consciously switch up their bindings on the fly. So I'll just quickly speed up time while I do this. Some of these you may never use as action layers, but I've decided to put all the possible inputs on here so you can see, and it might spark a little idea when you're designing your own profiles. Now very quickly, I will just show how we actually go about triggering these layers. So we'll keep the example of Y modifying left trigger. We assigned it, but still right now it is doing nothing. So if we go over to the face buttons, select Y and change the bindings to this icon here. As you can see, you can also change action sets here, but we are focusing on action layers. So you can have it so you press the button and the layer is applied. Press a button and it removes that layer, or have it so the layer is applied while you are actively holding that button down. And this can be modified further through activators. So you could have it so a regular press would just apply the layer, a double press would remove the layer, and then a long press will hold the layer. You'll see later in this episode as well how I will use the release press in a combination with the remove action layer function as a sort of safety net. You see, action layers aren't completely impervious to things going a bit wrong, but generally I find they're much more reliable than mode shifting and chorded presses, but you may still need a safety net or two now and then. Actually, I think that kind of serves as the fundamentals quite well. What we've covered here is the major bulk of what you'll be doing when assigning your own controller profiles. I think it is worth pointing out here though that if say you wanted to press a button and it fires off multiple bindings at once, you can select this toggle multi-button on feature. Select that and you can activate multiple bindings at once. If you instead want that button to cycle through these bindings one at a time, you can click on Show Activators and enable cycle binding. I haven't had much use for cycle bindings yet, but they are worth considering if your profile is getting too cluttered. But multi-button is certainly handy for desktop profiles where there is a limit on the number of activators. Don't worry, I know we are creating this template as a desktop profile, but when you assign it to a game, this limitation should be lifted. I still sometimes prefer to have separate activators for clarity, especially when it comes to activating multiple action layers on one button. You can actually do that as a multi-button, you just have to select the first action layer and select the same icon again for the next one. It's not terribly clear though. In these circumstances, I always choose separate activators because it is less of a pain in the arse if I need to remove one of them.
Oh, no!
But yeah, I think that serves as the fundamentals pretty well. There will of course be other things you can do that we will cover as we go throughout these videos. All we need to do now is export our config and save as a new personal binding, which should make this accessible from your profile regardless of what PC you are on. I'm calling mine KB+M template, but you can call it whatever you like.
No shit.
So let's move on to the featured game of the episode itself, Mountain Blade to Bannerlord. I should really give a proper introduction to the game, but I'm conscious of how long this video is running already. But in short, you build up an army, you fight armies, you diplomat lords, you manage your resources, and maybe you'll bother with setting up trade routes to grow said resources. The important thing to note, even in its current state of early access, is that the game is bloody terrific. Truly. The fine people at Tale Worlds who make these wonderful games deserve all of your chef kisses. Mwah! Quick reminder, the bindings we will use for all of these games are the defaults, unless I specify otherwise. So I mean, the defaults in the settings of the actual games themselves. If you have changed your key bindings, then you will either need to reset them to default or ensure that the bindings match when you are creating or editing this profile. So here's a sneak preview of what you can expect from this controller profile. You may be able to tell in the top left that the triggers will modify the right thumbstick, allowing you to block or attack in a direction in a way that kind of emulates the mouse movement feel of when you're playing this game with keyboard and mouse. And there are also options for ranged attacks as well, so you can adjust your sensitivity on the fly and also zoom in, much in a way as you would expect from aim down sights in a traditional first-person shooter. And there are also radial menus for commanding your troops as well. Okay, so from your library, navigate to the game, click it, then select Manage Game and head over to Controller Configuration. It should default to a keyboard and mouse template. What we want to do is go on Browse, Configs at the bottom. Now here are ones I made earlier, so head over to your other games. This is a fresh Steam profile for tidiness on my end, but if you have a bunch of profiles saved, start with Steam Controller Configs, Desktop. As you can see, here is my keyboard and mouse profile. Click that and you get a preview, and from here you can actually click on stuff and see what it does. You just can't edit any of it yet. To remedy that, click on Import and there you go. Template ready for tweaking. So player movement first off. Left thumbstick should already be assigned to WASD, and the way this is done is by having the style of input be the D-pad, which it should be by default. As you can see, you have a few options here for native controller support. You would select joystick move, and by default Steam will correctly assign it to left thumbstick. We want D-pad with 8-way overlap as the layout. 8-way is always a default and generally don't need to change this. Here, for example, it's perfect because it makes changing directions nice and smooth. But if you are using the stick to select between 4 items, hotkeyed from an inventory or something, and you keep accidentally triggering more than one with a single push, then you may want to change it to 4-way with no overlap. Next, we want to select click action. Pretty self-explanatory. When you click in the thumbstick, thing happens. For a regular press, which is what the default will always be, we are going with toggle crouch, which is Z. What I also want here is a long press, so add activator, select long press, and the binding we'll call walk run, which is caps lock. For most long press bindings, I reduce the long press time to between the N and G in the word long. It just feels better to me, a bit quicker, but you can tweak as it suits your preference. Now, I don't like walk run toggles, but at the time of recording this, Bannerlord does not have a hold to walk option. The reason I prefer holding a key opposed to a toggle is you can go some way to emulating console games where your movement speed is dictated by how far you are pushing the thumbstick. I'll be covering this in videos for other games, but as a teaser, this is done through additional settings and using outer ring bindings. I won't go into it here, but as a little challenge, I suppose, see if you can figure it out for yourself. In theory, you can make this work with a toggle walk, but I found it to be too inconsistent. Again, see if you can figure out how I try to make that work. So if we back out of the left thumbstick, and let's do the D-pad. So D-pad is of course a D-pad. I use the D-pad for weapon select shenanigans. I have the top direction as weapon mode, which is X. I'll be honest, I'm not a Mount and Blade veteran, and to my knowledge, this is just used to switch between a throwing spear being thrown or used as a melee weapon, but there may be some other function to it that I've not yet come across. For down, I have regular press as sheath, which is the backslash or hash key, depending on your region, I think. And a long press as drop menu, which is G. So tap to put your weapon away, or hold to bring up a radial to select what item you have that you wish to be rid of. Now, I feel I have to explain myself here, because if I had up and down on the D-pad as mouse wheel up and down respectively, then it would translate more seamlessly to navigating menus and zooming on the campaign map. As you'll see soon enough, I have an action layer for that. The thing is, for my precious immersion, I like to have it this way, and it feels more intuitive in my opinion, and I'll explain why in a moment. So let's set left D-pad to change shield, which is scroll down. We're also going to click on add activator, not to add a long press or anything, but instead we are going to enable hold to repeat turbo, and we will leave the repeat rate at default. Because games usually interpret the mouse scroll wheel in individual increments, without enabling this, if you hold the button down, it will only fire off once. Now that's fine for just selecting weapons, but if players found they are comfortable with this layout when navigating menus or campaign map, they can hold to scroll. You can increase the repeat rate to max to enable faster scrolling in these circumstances, but I find it a touch too sensitive when selecting shields or weapons. So let's do the same for D-pad right, call it change weapon, and it is to be bound to scroll up. So the explanation I promised is that the shield is something you hold on your left hand, and the weapon, two-handers notwithstanding, are held in the right hand. It just feels more intuitive to me. Okay, so right thumbstick now. As you can guess, this will control the direction you look when in battle, but also move the cursor in menus and the campaign map. And that does also include the launcher that opens up when you launch the game, so joystick mouse is correct here. I leave the sensitivity here at default. For click action, it has to be kick really, doesn't it? That is bound to E. If you find that you keep accidentally kicking, I recommend changing this to a double press instead. Honestly, kicks aren't that useful, but they are quite satisfying, you know, when you do land them. For the face buttons, as you can see, the style of input is button pad. We will start with Y, which we will call campaign map / menu navigation, and we want to select next to the name field, which is for action sets and layers. So click on that, select from the drop down menu, hold action layer. So we want to select the action layer for Y and untick those boxes. Beep on change is for Steam controllers, and display action set on change is supposed to display the name of the action layer on screen, but honestly it rarely ever works for me. It may be because I usually play an exclusive full screen. It may work better for borderless. In fact, the only time it has worked for me is on the desktop. But it would be annoying, certainly for how frequently you'll be applying action layers in this game, so we'll just disable it. The button is now set for that action layer, which we will adjust the bindings for in a mo. Put simply for now, the Y button will be something you hold to modify how you interact with various elements of the game, mostly menu and campaign map screens, but there are a couple of things it will change in battles as well. So B next, regular press command menu, which is backspace, add activator, select long press, call it command wheel LS, which is for left stick, assign to hold action layer for B, and then adjust long press duration. We'll go into more detail when we customize that action layer, but in short, you press the B button to bring up the command interface, and you can press what will be right bumper to move your troops about. You'll also be able to hold the B button and use the D-pad to select groups and move the left thumbstick to give orders beyond just moving them where you click. The A button is nice and simple. It's just jump, which is space, but can also double up as pause or unpause on the campaign map. X, regular press is use interact, which is F, and long press will adjust the time, call it party movement menu hotkeys, and assign it as a hold action layer for X. So the party movement bit, I wanted to incorporate this in the Y action layer somehow, but I couldn't really get it to fit. What this does is when you are on the campaign map, if you hold X, you can use the left thumbstick to manually move your party around instead of clicking. Also within the campaign map, you can hold X and hold directions on the D-pad to bring up inventory, character screen, party screen, etc. Back button now. Regular press will be toggle first person, third person view, which is R, and then for a long press will be quick save campaign map, which is F5. For games with quick save and quick load, I always have those assigned as long presses for back and start buttons respectively, so I'm being consistent here. For quick save and load, I tend to leave the long press time as default, just so it's a little less likely that you'll trigger it by mistake. There is no quick load in this game, however, so the start button of course does not have this binding. Speaking of the start button, nice and simple, just a regular press we'll call menu, and the binding is escape. Time for the bumpers. So in most games I will have left click and right click assigned to triggers, but there is a very important reason why I've opted against that for this game, which will become clear shortly. First though, to break this pattern of moving left to right that I've set precedent for in this video, we'll start with the right bumper. Just a simple regular press, which I'll be naming ranged stroke vanilla attack, stroke mouse click, and the binding is left mouse. Ooh, vanilla attack you say? Whatever could it mean? Hold your horses, all will become clear. Left bumper is a bit more complex, so regular press is vanilla block, which is right mouse. Then we are going to add a chorded press, yes, it makes sense to do here, The chorded button will be right bumper, the name will be ranged mode, and the binding will be to hold action layer LB. Why not RB? You'll see, you'll see. We are also going to add a safety net activator. I determined to be necessary from troubleshooting the action layer getting stuck. It will be a release press, not going to name it anything, and it will be to remove action layer LB. Now off camera I will be tidying up the action layers, removing ones we don't need and naming them properly. For now though, I'm just going to rename the LB action layer to LT/LB ranged. Okay, so what's all that about? Vanilla this, range mode that. Okay, so we need to talk about the central gimmick, I suppose, of this control setup. Like I say, normally left and right mouse will be on the triggers for my profiles, but here the triggers will be used in conjunction with the right thumbstick to give the same motion control-y feel of mouse-based blocks and attacks. If you want to block, you hold the left trigger and move the right thumbstick in the direction you want to block. Same thing for an attack, right thumbstick determines the direction of your swing. In order to do this, we cannot have the game reading a left click or a mouse click for when the player is just pressing or holding down either of those triggers, which is a problem for ranged attacks. So if you equip a bow or javelins or rocks, you'll instead be pressing and holding to charge attack the right bumper, and you just aim with the right thumbstick as you would in any first person shooter. I included the names vanilla attack and block because essentially it is just left and right mouse clicks, so if you want, you can just attack normally and your view will swing as much as you allow it to. So the option is there, but I don't think you'll want to use that. As for ranged mode, well, if you have your ranged weapon equipped and you're holding right bumper to prime your attack or draw the bow or whatever, if you hold left bumper it will reduce the sensitivity, allowing you to fine aim. We will also have it so if instead of left bumper you hold left trigger, you'll have the same fine aim but also the view will zoom in, just as you would expect from aim down sights in a first person shooter. So let's get all this stuff set up, shall we? This is where things are going to get a bit more involved. So let's start with the left trigger. We are going with soft pull actions. In most circumstances a full pull is fine, but for this particular setup I found soft pull worked better. We're going to need multiple activators, so regular, chord, chord, release, release. 2 safety nets this time. So for regular we want to name that block mode, hold layer LT soft. For the first chord, make sure you change interruptible to off, as this will prevent any issues of this not firing off properly. And by the way, if I don't mention anything about any of this stuff, then leave it as default. As for this chorded press, we want the binding to be called range mode, with the same hold activation layer LT LB ranged. The next chorded press is also not to be interrupted, so turn that bad boy off. The binding will call simply zoom, and that will be the shift key. Now you could do this as a multi-button on one activator, but I just prefer it this way. It's a bit neater in my opinion. That will of course be chorded to right bumper. For the first release press, again, we won't bother naming the safety nets, so that will just be remove action layer LT LB ranged, and the next release press will be remove action layer LT soft. Remember, we still have to actually set up those action layers. Right now we are just pointing these inputs to the correct direction. Now, right trigger, again, soft pull action. Regular press will be attack mode and hold layer RT soft. And release press, you guessed it, remove action layer RT soft. Right, so with the default layers all set up, we now need to set up the changes that the action layers will bring. So let's do block mode first. That's LT soft. Navigate to there. Now we want to go to the right thumbstick, and first of all we want to look at outer ring binding. So what does this do? If you push the thumbstick a certain distance, which is customizable, you will fire off an input. In this case, we want that input to be right mouse. Now, in order to fulfill our goal of having a motion control-y type of feel, we don't want the camera swinging about. We want the view to be as still as possible in terms of panning and tilting. However, it cannot be completely stationary because the game does require some movement in order to register the intended direction of your swing or block. Now, you could change the settings in-game to movement-based blocking and attacking and changing the right thumbstick to a D-pad layout bound to WASD. You'd probably actually need to use an action layer or something to stop further inputs so you don't keep moving in the direction if you're holding. I did try this with Warband and I forget exactly what I did. This will absolutely keep the view perfectly still. However, this causes problems if you are strafing in the direction that you are also holding block or attack, as one will cancel out the other. And that usually results in your strafe being interrupted, so you're just stopping your tracks more or less. So back to what we were doing, we want the sensitivity lowered all the way down, all the way. Again, it's important that mouse sensitivity in game is left at default. If you don't have it on default, you'll need to tweak this yourself accordingly. Next, we want to click on additional settings. First thing to mention, if, like me, you play first-person games on the controller with an inverted y-axis, you'll need to ensure in the game you have selected that in the options. And then in block mode and attack mode action layers only, you'll want to turn invert vertical axis to on. If you don't do that, you'll press down to block, but in-game you will block upwards. Same with attack. Down is usually a thrust, and up is usually an overhead swing, and not inverting this will upset that. So we already shrank the sensitivity down to the minimum on the last screen, but surprisingly enough, it's still too high. You can see here that you can adjust it further on the horizontal and vertical scale independently. We'll shove both of these down to a little over halfway. I'll use the word horizontal as a guide. You want to be between the T and A, just like your dad does. For vertical, just line it up as best you can, should be just a smidge before the S in scale. I can't honestly say I have got it to the absolute threshold of where the game will read the movement, but hair seemed to work great and there is barely any movement in the camera. We also want to make sure that the game is reading the correct direction. Part of that is down to the player's thumbstick discipline. So what we can do is shrink the outer binding radius as much as possible, so that the thumbstick has to be pushed almost all the way before it fires off the input. The bar, specifically for the outer ring binding radius, is a little confusing, but unless I'm sorely mistaken, and this has just somehow worked out for me, the grey part of the bar is actually the size of the radius, so we want to increase the bar to decrease the radius. It's hard to say for certain because, as you can see, the visual representation is pretty damn buggy, or at least it is for me. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a letter to tell you where to drag that meter up to, so what I do is, from the default position, get your controller in hand and move it by 3 increments to the right, with the left thumbstick or D-pad. As long as it's as close to that as possible, it should be fine. We now want to look at the dead zone options. Out of curiosity, I did try dead zone shapes other than the cross shape, but those did not work as well, so definitely stick with that. I have the inner dead zone aligned under the E in zone, and the outer dead zone completely maxed out. Bear in mind, I have only tested this on an Xbox One controller that is in good nick, so you may need to tweak this if you're using something else or your controller has wear and tear, and these inputs aren't registering correctly. You should start by tweaking these options to see if you can get it working. Assuming you have an Xbox One pad in good condition, then I can confirm that this works fine how I've set it. Right, so similar thing with attack mode. So let's go over to the RT soft action layer. Head over to the right thumbstick, which should also be joystick mouse. Select the outer ring binding as left mouse. Drop the sensitivity all the way down. Additional settings, dead zone inner, under the E. Down where it's wetter, where it's much better, under the E. Dead zone outer cranked all the way up. Invert vertical axis if need be. Horizontal sensitivity under the A. Vertical under the S. Now for the outer ring binding radius, I found that cranking it all the way up gives the best results. Why that's different to block, I don't really know. Sorry. One extra step I include here is to change LT soft. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking at first that you can't actually change these bindings because they're all greyed out, and if you try to select them, nothing happens. But if you click on Add Activator, you'll get this message pop up. Now, if you want all the activators in the default profile to stay in place, but you want additional activators while this action layer is active, then you can copy the activators and do just that. However, we don't want any of that, so let's click on OK. And as you can see, the activators are all gone. You can remove the default activator that now appears and back out, and it will be just as though you had selected cancel in that pop-up. So we want a regular press soft pull, which we will call feign attack. So the way it works on Mountain Blade is that if you have an attack charged with the left mouse, if you click and hold the right mouse at the same time, you'll cancel the attack and go into a block. At this point, you can keep blocking or you can change your attack direction. And the binding will be... Oh no! I fucked up! Yeah, I forgot actually whilst when it came to editing this, that this feign attack thing was a late game change that actually kind of broke a bunch of stuff. There have been a lot of revisions of this controller profile, so I do apologise. I left it in because that little explanation of how you remove those activators will be helpful going forward. So yeah, you can just use feign attack, by holding left trigger whilst you've got your attack primed. So yeah, don't worry about that. Earlier, we set up the action layer for LT-LB range mode. Incredibly simple, this one. Just pop over to the right thumbstick and drop the sensitivity down to between O and U in mouse. This works for me at least. You can obviously tweak this if you find it too slow or still too fast. So again, if you are charging a ranged attack with RB, if you hold LB, it will now slow down your aim. If you hold LT, the same action layer will kick in, but we also set up a chorded press before to zoom in at the same time. Next action layer we will look at is the command wheel for the B button. Now this isn't actually just a wheel, in fact let's start with the back button. Just a regular press, call it all troops, and bind that to 0. Not numpad 0, just plain 0. So when holding B button, if you press the back button, you will call attention to all of your troops to give follow-up commands to. On the D-pad, we will assign the numbered groups 1 to 8. So for me, if there are numeric keybinds that total 4 or more, I start at 12 o'clock and go clockwise. So regular press on D-pad up will be 1, right 2, down 3, left 4. What I then do is use long presses for 5 to 8, again going clockwise. I'll show you D-pad up and then fast forward the rest because it's dead obvious. So regular press, select group 1, long press, select group 5. And remember to adjust the long press duration. Just bear in mind, if you only have 3 groups for example, if you activate 4 or higher, it will function the same as all troops, bound to 0. Left thumbstick now, we want style of input to be radial menu, and what this does is when you push the thumbstick, an overlay will show buttons that you can select with the direction of the thumbstick. There are a couple of ways you can activate your selection. I found clicking the thumbstick to be the most reliable, so we are going with that. But you can have it so when you release the thumbstick, it activates when you release the activator button, so B in this case, or you can have it so the radial button will activate as soon as you push the stick in that direction. Beneath that you have the position, size and opacity of the radial menu. I'm happy with the defaults for opacity and size, but for position I have horizontal placed just a smidge before H, and the vertical position under the N, like so. There are 5 buttons to the right of that which we can assign bindings to. We'll need more than that, which we'll get to in a moment. For now we just want to assign these as regular presses F1 to F5. We don't actually want to name these anything because their function will change depending on the type of order you are giving, and all this will be visible on screen so you know what F button corresponds to which. So for more buttons we want to click on additional settings, and crikey, look at all them buttons. So let's add F6 to F9. Now F9 is always cancel and will revert back to the last order set, so I want that to stand out. So if we select the icon button far in the top right, and I actually just use the default icon for this. The default icon will not show unless you bring this menu up and manually select it. So in game it will no longer say F9 but will show this instead. You don't have to do this, I just think it's easier to see at a glance. And yeah, if you want to back out of the radial menu completely, just simply release the B button. So next action layer is for the Y button. Now this really isn't essential. You can navigate menus and campaign map just fine without this action layer, but it does provide you with extra functionality and comfort options. So we'll be jumping all over the controller at this point just because it flows a bit better when explaining it. So first of all, the left thumbstick, we actually want to keep it as D-pad layout bound to WASD, so no changes there. For the click action, we want to remove the current activators and replace with a regular press called Show Indicators. That will be bound to left Alt. So when holding Y and clicking and holding left thumbstick, it will bring up icons for people of interest in towns, or your commanders in battle, and a few other things that I've forgotten about. Next up, let's look at the D-pad. So as I alluded to before, you can just use left and right on the D-pad as a scroll wheel for menu navigation and the campaign map. But if you find it a bit confusing, we've got some bindings to make that will serve as an alternative. So for D-pad up, we want to add activator just so we can access the turbo. Here I crank the repeat rate all the way up, so scrolling is a little bit quicker. We want the binding to be mouse scroll up, of course. Scroll up, zoom in, campaign map. Same thing for D-pad down. Crank the repeat rate all the way up. Binding to be named scroll down, zoom out, campaign map. And bound to mouse scroll down. I mentioned before that you can use the A button with no action layers enabled to pause resume the game, but here we will set it up so D-pad left will fulfill the same function, named pause resume campaign map, bound to space. And then for D-pad right, we'll name it fast forward campaign map, which is bound to number 3. Next we have the back buttons. We shall name tab, keep holding Y. And I feel that this binding is something that may trip players up. In order to exit a town, you need to hold tab until the meter fills up. As you need to hold Y to make the back button function as tab, if you let go of Y while you are holding the back button, it will interrupt that progress. Even though I created this profile knowing full well it would do this, I keep forgetting because I'm an idiot. So this name is just a nice reminder the player can see if they open the profile because they're confused about why they can't exit a town. Now, I could have avoided this by having tab bound to back without an action layer selected, and instead requiring you to hold Y to change between first person and third person views. But as you need to hold tab in the aforementioned circumstances, then I would not be able to have a long press for quick save, and that is something I really want to keep consistent between profiles. Bumpers now. Left bumper we will call TP zoom in, which is bound to numpad plus. RB will be called TP zoom out, which is numpad minus. So in third person view, this will allow you to zoom in and out. I don't know about anyone else, but I usually prefer zooming in to be on the right side and zoom out to be on the left. However, because LT when aiming a ranged weapon zooms your view in, I wanted consistency there, so left side of the pad is always for zooming. We will also have a binding for left trigger soft pull, so clear those activators and name it zoom view battle, increase scroll speed campaign map. And map that to shift, so in a battle you can zoom in without being in range mode, and in the campaign map you will increase the speed the camera scrolls as you move with the left thumbstick. So last but actually kinda least as well, we have the action layer for X. So for back button we have a regular press which is for quests, and that is bound to J. The D-pad I'll quickly go through. It's for accessing various screens from the campaign map. Same principles as selecting groups in the command wheel action layer. Regular presses and long presses. So in those orders from 12 o'clock going clockwise we have inventory and encyclopedia, I and N, party and banner editor, P and B, character and face generator, C and V, then finally clan and kingdom, which is L and K. And then left stick will be for moving the party around the campaign map without pointing and clicking with the mouse cursor. So we'll name them all Move X Direction, and they are bound to the arrow keys. I just emptied the click action as well, so you don't accidentally trigger something unexpected. Okay, so just a late game change here. It was just one of those what the fuck are you thinking moments. But I've on the D-pad as a long press for D-pad up. I've got it so it is a hold action layer for a new action layer I've created called slow cursor. And as you can imagine, that just slows down your cursor or reduces the sensitivity of the right thumbstick. So in menus, you know, it's a bit easier to navigate, you know, particularly if you're trying to click on small UI elements. And can be useful on the campaign map as well. And you can see here that there's also a middle mouse click. The reason for that is if we go up to the left trigger, you can see that I've also put tab here as well. Now, the reason being is that I noticed very late on that if you want to retreat, you actually have to be holding tab and then click middle mouse button to bring up the cursor to then be able to select that button. So with this setup, you can now do that if you're a pussy. So, at time of recording, that should be every button you could possibly bind in the game, all catered for. Well, except for one.
Holy Jesus! What is that? What the fuck is that?
Seriously, maybe it's because I'm an idiot, but I have no idea what that key is, and I honestly couldn't be bothered to find out. It's completely non-essential though. From what I can gather, you can view your character model and maybe swing the view around it. If you want to include it on the profile, you should be able to spot a few openings in some of the action layers, but I'm afraid I'm going to leave that for you to do. Now, I did mention how you can tidy up the D-pad a bit, but obviously you have to consider that a game designed with controller support in mind can swap functions on the fly depending on the screen they are on. Considering that there is no active action set swapping on this profile, I think this is a pretty neat and tidy setup. I won't ever claim something is perfect, and any tweaks that you may have, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've done your own custom controller profiles with these kind of tweaks already implemented, I'm happy to check them out and give a shout out where I can. I'm not doing this because I want everyone to use my profiles or anything. I'm much more interested in people enjoying the games they want to play, how they want to play it, and if I can learn from some cool ideas that other people have, then to me that is awesome. Cool, that was a long one, wasn't it? Thanks so much for sticking around. Haven't finished editing it yet, obviously, because I'm recording this footage. And yeah, so I don't know if I got it under the hour mark. It probably went a bit over, so I do apologise. Yeah, future episodes will not be that long because obviously we're not doing the initial setup every time, and you know, not introducing me to the channel and you know this twat who's talking now. But yeah, so future episodes should be a lot quicker, or a lot shorter. And but if you do, you know, if hopefully you've learned something or at least found it a bit interesting. If you've got any sort of ideas of your own, I'm happy to hear them. If you pop them down in the comments below. And that's what the YouTubers do, don't they? I mean, I'll be totally honest. I never really frequent the YouTube comment section myself, so it's a bit hypocritical for me to ask other people to comment below, but hopefully, you know, a bunch of like-minded people sort of, you know, get drawn to this video and, yeah, if got some ideas, tips or anything like that, share them. You know, happy to do, like, shout-outs or, you know, perhaps I'll even, you know, with your permission, sort of make a video of, like, a profile that you've designed and, obviously give credit where credit is due. And, yeah, I mean, that's really what I'd like to achieve with this channel, is just to see, build up a little bit of a community. And yeah, just share some cool ideas about, you know, different ways to play the games that we love so much. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But thanks ever so much again, and hopefully see you on the next one. Bye.
Hello!
Now that is radical.